Good afternoon, everyone. We will get started in just a moment. Well, good afternoon again, and welcome to today's webinar, School-Based Mental Health Screening, Part 2, How Do We Respond? Legal and Ethical Follow-Up for School Mental Health Screening, with our presenter, Dr. Miranda Zahn. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Great Lakes MHTTC and SAMHSA. The Great Lakes ATTC, MHTTC, and PTTC are funded by SAMHSA under the following cooperative agreements. The opinions expressed in this webinar are the views of the speaker and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services and SAMHSA. The MHTTC network believes that words matter and uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all activities. For more upcoming events and information, please follow the Great Lakes MHTTC on social media or visit our website. A few housekeeping items. If you're having any technical issues, please message me, Jen Winslow, or Rebecca Buller. That's a typo. So Jen Winslow or Rebecca Buller in the chat section at the bottom of your screen. And we will be happy to assist you. If you have any questions for the speaker, please try to put those in the Q&A section on your Zoom toolbar rather than the chat section. It helps us keep those organized and allows us to, so that our presenter can answer those. If captions or live transcript would be helpful, please use your Zoom toolbar to enable them by going into the More section, select Captions, and Show Captions. At the end of this session, you will be automatically redirected to a very brief survey. Certificates of attendance will be sent out via email to all who attended the session in full. The recording and presentation materials will be available on the Great Lakes MHTTC website within a week following the presentation. And I want to welcome our presenter, Dr. Miranda Zahn. Miranda is an assistant professor of school psychology at the University of South Dakota. She conducts research, training, and technical assistance in school-based mental health services. Specifically, Miranda focuses on social justice and the role of teachers and school supports for youth mental health. In addition, Miranda is a school psychologist and school mental health provider at Nebraska's Educational Service Unit Number 1, where she provides direct services to youth as well as training and systems consultation to schools. Again, welcome everyone, and I will turn it over to you, Miranda.
Hello all, I'm so grateful that you are choosing to join us today to learn a little bit more about screening and what to do after you've screened. I hope that you all maybe have watched part 1, where you, if you haven't watched yet, will learn about things like how to choose a screener, how to go about setting up systems and procedures and policies in your school system to support screening. Today, we'll be talking a little bit more about what happens after we screen. So I'm eager to get started and hope that you are enjoying this sort of maybe transition from the end of the school year into summer. A little bit about me. My name is Miranda Zahn. Like Jen mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of school psychology at the University of South Dakota, where I teach classes and do research and provide hopefully some meaningful service to my community by working with the Educational Service Unit 1 and others to help shore up some systems in my region. In addition to those roles, I'm a consultant at the National Center for School Mental Health, where I support technical assistance and development of some school mental health materials that hopefully support folks across the nation. My background and training are in school psychology. I received my PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in school psychology. And my lenses, I think that it's really important that my identity and sort of experiences shape the way that I look at the world, the way that I think about problems, and probably the way that I'm talking to you about some things today. So the lenses that I bring that, I try to be mindful of the ways that they impact are that I'm a white woman. I am cisgender and use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm heterosexual, non-religious. I'm in the middle class, although I've been in different socioeconomic statuses across my life, and I don't have any visible disabilities. Our learning objectives today, so the sorts of things that you might take away today that you'll know how to do after you learn today, are that I hope that you'll understand some of the legal and ethical obligations associated with mental health screening in schools. Second, we'll identify some of the follow-up assessment procedures that you might use. We know that many kids might be screened in, and that's a really big, scary challenge. We want to be able to support all of our kids. And one of the ways that we can do that is to gather more information rather than intervening immediately on screening data. A third learning objective is that you'll be able to identify some needs assessment procedures to align mental health screening with intervention and referral procedures at your school. Last, I hope that you'll learn a little bit about the mechanisms for pinpointing and intervening on school and class level trends when we're using mental health screening data. So you can understand sort of where to intervene, whether to intervene with a specific kid, a small group, a grade, a class, a school. And so we'll be learning some of those different axes of follow-up after screening. So as sort of a really brief primer, and I do hope that if you haven't already watched it, you'll go back to session 1 where I went a little bit more in depth on this. But just as a broad overview, universal mental health screening is a population-based preventative procedure where we access an individual's likelihood of developing a mental health condition. We can identify through screening who might be at risk. Wrong slide, who might be at risk of having a mental health condition in the future. It is not a mechanism to identify current mental health diagnoses. It's not a way for us to uncover or reveal specific symptoms of mental health disorders. It's really a way for us to take a population-based approach. That means understanding something about our whole group of kids and the ways that they might be developing risk and protective factors that might in the future lead to challenges. So using this approach to universal mental health screening, all students might be screened and provided the same opportunity for potential early identification and service provision. When we screen all students, we provide some questions to all students to understand their functioning. We can understand best how to serve the broad range of student needs in our school and also understand the ways that our students might overlap with one another, the things that they might have in common that we can maybe address on a broad level rather than in individual intervention with particular one-on-one students. Some of the benefits of universal mental health screening are that we can reduce the risk or impact of mental health conditions. If we've got some of those early markers or even more severe markers, we can learn about those earlier, particularly for the mental health conditions that we might characterize at the mental health conditions or symptoms or needs that we might characterize as internalizing, that they're internal to one person. There are personal experiences, our emotions, our perspectives. Those are things that frequently we're not noticing sort of out loud in the classroom. Things like externalizing behaviors, which we might classify as those behaviors that we can observe, such as maybe you've got a kiddo in your classroom who is frequently fighting with peers. You've got a kiddo who has a hard time managing their emotions and might, use objects to harm themselves or others. Those sorts of things that we can observe, we're more likely to see in schools. Unfortunately, we also know that those things that are internal to children can sort of rear their ugly heads later. And it's best for us to be able to notice those, learn about them early through something like mental health screening, so we can provide support before things maybe escalate. Another great thing about universal mental health screening is that we can obtain a baseline for future monitoring and assessment. You might go to the doctor's office and get your heart rate taken every year while you're healthy, and that might be the way that a doctor might know that like your heart rate is changing, so there might be something amiss. When we know how folks are functioning when things are going well, we can notice a disruption in that pattern to learn sort of kind of right away that something is happening that we might need to pay attention to. We also know that universal mental health screening is a cost-efficient approach. There are a lot of different ways that we might talk about identifying kids in need of mental health supports. And some of those include training teachers to identify small warning signs, or it might be waiting for referrals from parents or teachers for kids who might need additional support. All of these things lead us to a place where we're only noticing those kids who have more severe or intense needs that require more individualized intervention. If we can notice things earlier, our approach to fixing the challenges can be a lot more sort of high leverage or a little more efficient. So that helps us cut costs on those deeper interventions later. Mental health screening is really best when we couple it with MTSS. Many schools have adopted MTSS for academics with the RTI, or response to intervention process, where we assess where kids are regularly, and as soon as they start to slip, we then provide intervention immediately so they don't fall behind. We can take the same approach with mental health screening, and really this is the best practice in mental health screening. So at Tier 1 with all students, we can engage in mental health screening, climate screening, and then based on that data, we might engage in some universal interventions, things like school-wide or class-wide behavior interventions, or social emotional learning curriculum, civic engagement opportunities for youth, and things like that that might support all students. For those kids who maybe need a little boost, for whom those universal measures aren't quite enough, we might move to Tier 2. Tier 2 is where we're looking at a more selected group, folks who maybe were identified as at risk, or for whom what we're doing for everyone isn't quite enough. For these kids, we can provide some targeted mental health intervention. Usually at Tier 2, this is time limited. We're maybe doing a 6-week small group intervention to just give them a little bit of a boost, a little running start, so that that universal stuff can be more supportive for them. At Tier 2, we're also doing progress monitoring so we can understand if those little time-limited interventions we're providing really are effective and they're enough for our kiddo to return to Tier 1 or benefit from Tier 2 intervention. We do know that there are some kids who might need more than that Tier 2 intervention. They need more than that time-limited, brief small group pullout. They might need mental health supports throughout their school day. They might need behavioral intervention that's more individualized or one-on-one. Something that might be more customized and involve them meeting one-on-one with a school counselor or mental health professional. For those students, we, through progress monitoring at Tier 2, can learn what they need at Tier 3 and then provide that in the form of intensive school or community intervention. In a lot of schools, this Tier 3 might look like a referral for special education, although really that should exist above Tier 3, and we should hopefully be able to provide some more one-on-one supports even outside of special education. Some of the things that guide where we move with MTSS in school mental health and mental health screening are really through the lens of following our relevant federal laws. It's important that as we educate students, we're identifying all of the barriers to their learning. You might see in schools things like vision screening, hearing screening, some other base level sort of physical health screenings that help us to learn the types of problems or challenges that get in the way of youth learning. For example, if a kid has a vision concern that's found through screening, that vision concern, if left untreated, might mean that they never are able to see the board. They're not able to fully access the textbooks that they're supposed to learn from. And so when we know through vision screening that a kid needs additional support, we can then refer their parents to get glasses. Glasses are a really, really simple way that we can make sure that that kid has access to the education that we're providing in school, which is our requirement as public educators. In a similar way, mental health concerns, conditions, risk factors can get in the way of learning, particularly when we think about folks who have significant challenges, like have experienced trauma, have behavioral dysregulation and things like that. It can really get in the way of access to education and academics, which is sort of the core of our role in schools. So there's a few federal laws, particularly the Individuals with Disability Education Act, that say that we need to know and identify the sorts of things that might get in the way of learning. So the way that IDEA, which is listed second here, they're in alphabetical order, but I'm going to talk about it first. The way that IDEA really guides mental health screening is that it says that we have a child-find responsibility. We have a responsibility to identify those kids who might have a disability and provide them services so that they can access education. The forms of screening that IDEA requires are, there's a lot of guidance. So I encourage you to familiarize yourself with that legislation if you aren't already familiar. But really it says that we have to do our due diligence and evaluate all of the sort of barriers to learning that might exist and provide supports to kids who might experience those barriers. Of course, as we're doing screening and assessment to understand what barriers to learning exist, there are a whole bunch of laws, particularly FERPA and HIPAA, which I put on here, that guide the ways that we collect information, the ways that we communicate about the information that we have to really protect the rights of folks in the school system. Frequently in schools, we're familiar with FERPA. So the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act is a piece of federal legislation that really legislates or guides the ways that we might communicate about educational information for children. This is the piece of legislation that broadly, again, I encourage you to read into this particular piece of legislation, because I'm not going to give an in-depth overview, just the ways that it's maybe most prescient to mental health screening. So FERPA really guides the fact that, or the big takeaway, I guess, from FERPA is that we can share educational information with folks as long as it is educationally relevant. We might share information with, if we've got a second grader and we've noticed some things, we might share information about what we've noticed with the third grade teacher, so that third grade teacher knows what that kid needs. We might also share information about what's happening in the classroom. For example, if a student is having difficulty focusing one day, we might share that with the music teacher when we escort the class down to music, so the music teacher sort of knows what to expect, right? We can share things that are seen as maybe educational records or that we learn through the course of educating children with folks for whom that is educationally relevant. This also says that adults who are the guardian or parent of a child have the rights to see any piece of data that is in a child's educational record. It also guides the types of things that need to be put in the educational record. For example, if we're doing an observation and we take video so that we can make that observation maybe more clear or better, then that video automatically must become part of the educational record and be accessible to parents. So FERPA really guides the fact that parents have to be involved and have a right to access and know about what's happening in the school context. It also says that we can share relevant things among educational professionals. When we're getting into student health information, which mental health screening data can be considered, we start to get into the territory of HIPAA. So the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act really governs legislation around the privacies that are afforded to us by the federal government around health. This says that, HIPAA includes a lot of pieces and really says the types of ways that health information can be shared. It is a lot tighter than FERPA and says that things really can only be shared when there is consent, when someone is part of the health sort of team for an individual, which many folks on a mental health team in a school would be considered. So that one just kind of nails down a little bit more about who can access what and is really relevant. One that I didn't put on this list, but might be relevant depending on sort of funding sources that are governing the work you do, is the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment, which really says some things about what information we might be able to gather when we're using U.S. Department of Education funds. So if you're using federal education dollars, there are some rules about the types of things that you can collect and the ways that we need to collect those. I'm going to get more into consent later, but PPRA really talks a lot about getting consent. And something relevant there is that it says that PPRA says that if you're using federal Department of Education funds, you have to get active consent for a few things. There are 8 sort of protected categories under PPRA that I'll go through in a second. And it talks about sort of active consent and passive consent. So we'll talk about that on the next slide. But really, when we're thinking about HIPAA, FERPA, IDEA, and PPRA, there are a bunch of legal responsibilities that we have to ensure compliance. These are really important because none of us want our districts to get sued. And beyond that, it's really important that we're protecting the rights of the children and the families who are, entrusted in our care. Beyond sort of the fear of suing, these pieces of legislation are really in place so that we can, safely support the kids that are in our schools. So the types of things that we need to be making sure we're complying with are consent procedures, we're maintaining confidentiality, we're storing data in a way that allows ample security, we're collaborating with parents and legal guardians, and we're establishing clear policies and procedures that can be accessed by folks who might be interested in the types of work that we're doing, including families. I guess I didn't make slides for each of these individually, so I'll go through them now. First is consent. So generally, we fill our legal guidelines, legal and ethical guidelines, when we engage in opt-out or passive consent for school mental health screening. So what this means is that we notify all families of the consent or of the screening that we're going to do. We tell them we're going to do X screener on X date, and the purpose of that is to understand if there are social and emotional barriers to learning for your child. We also must provide an opportunity for folks to decide that that maybe isn't the best choice for their family or their child. They have a clear and accessible way to opt out of that procedure. What that might look like is folks can return a form. So if we send a paper information form to families that includes the information, we might at the bottom give a form that says, or give a sort of slip that says, you can sign to opt your child out. That is what opt-out or passive consent means. Some other ways that I've seen folks do this is to send out, the district-wide robocall to say, hey, we're doing this. You can text this phone number or send an email or provide written documentation that you'd like to opt your child out. Folks might also use something like Class Dojo or another notification system that's common, that families are familiar with, and that folks really will look at. This notification is not just a box to check. We really do want folks to know what we're doing. Under PPRA, consent falls into two categories of passive or active. Under PPRA, there are 8 sort of sections or 8 protected pieces of information that we would need to get active consent for. The ones that are relevant to school mental health screening, I'll read them now, are if we're surveying about mental or psychological problems of the student or student's family. This really would mean those diagnoses or diagnosable symptoms. Usually when we're doing mental health screening, this isn't relevant, or we're not asking about sort of mental health disorders in the way that PPRA outlines. And then the second is if we're asking about illegal, antisocial, self-incriminating, or demeaning behavior. So it's really important, if we're using those federal dollars, that we look at these individual items on our screening tool to understand whether either of these or the 6 other categories under PPRA are included. Usually they're not, but to do our due diligence, we really should be checking those items to make sure that we are compliant with this law. If none of those 8 categories are checked, then PPRA requires that we give notice and an opportunity to opt a student out of other surveys. PPRA also says that we must give folks a right to inspect the information or the screening tool that we'll be using. Second, for legal compliance is confidentiality. We really need to make sure that under FERPA and HIPAA, we're only sharing information with those folks who under FERPA have an educational need to know, and under HIPAA are part of the student's care team. So for example, it wouldn't be relevant or it wouldn't be appropriate for us to share, that Dawson in 3rd grade got 14 points on the screener, which is in the at-risk range, with the music teacher, right? That person isn't part of sort of that mental health care team in the school-based setting. So beyond FERPA, we need to comply with HIPAA when we're dealing with student health records. Next is proper data storage and security. This is something that's really important, particularly as we, are in a highly digital sort of time in our world and are frequently storing things online. Schools frequently have access to, for example, encrypted Google Drive or use Box or OneDrive, SharePoint, things like that. And we just need to make sure that there's appropriate sort of encryption, which hopefully your school has a tech team to help you identify proper storage procedures for educational records and student health records. Some things here to keep in mind also are that if you're using your school-wide information system, you might use Infinite Campus or Power School or something like that, just to make sure that you have sort of the level of encryption that means that folks can't access student data that they shouldn't have access to. As long as you have this documented, usually the procedures that schools already use to protect data are sufficient. We just want to make sure that there's not like, one member of the mental health team using their personal computer and saving files on a personal computer that isn't password protected and is shared with, for example, their spouse who doesn't have a need to know. And is a non-student healthcare teams. So we need to properly take care of data to make sure that these pupil records are kept secure. We also need to collaborate with parents and legal guardians. This is can look like part of that consent process where we're notifying folks. It also can look like making sure that there is an opportunity for folks to ask questions about why we're screening, the importance of screening, or have a contact to reach out to for those. Last, clear policies and procedures really would look like having in your student handbook in maybe the same spot at the beginning of the year. Maybe you have forms that say, we're going to do vision screening in week 4 of school, and we're going to do hearing screening in week 6. You might include there, hey, we're looking at all the different things that might impact student learning. Mental health is one of them. So here's what we're doing to screen that. It's just important that you make sure that you're delineating the types of things that you'll be doing around mental health screening so that this isn't a surprise or shock. Because, social emotional learning right now is something, or social emotional learning, mental health is something that folks can be relatively sensitive about, right? We're sharing, or we're asking folks to share information that can be seen as really personal and really private. But when we're sort of upfront about it, when we're sharing the reason and our rationale, that can, through clear policies and procedures, ample time for folks to see those, and ample ways for folks to perhaps respond or ask questions that can really help us to ensure that we are protecting the rights of our students. Beyond legalities, there are also a whole host of ethical codes that might guide our behavior when we're doing mental health assessment and screening. Some that I find the most relevant because they're likely tied with the folks who are on that mental health team, that student mental health care team, and the folks who are probably doing the screening, have professional expertise in screening. I included links to these 3 ethical codes. I'm going to go into a little bit more on the next few slides about the types of things that these 3 codes kind of agree on or say that we should be doing. But the 3 that I'm including are the American School Counselor Association, Ethical Standards for School Counselors, which is linked in the slides that you'll get after our meeting today. The National Association of School Psychologists has professional standards that include a section on principles for professional ethics. And then the National Association of Social Workers has a set of standards for school social work services. So these 3 organizations really define the ways that we should comply, that we should ensure and protect the rights of the students and families we work with. Some things or some areas that these folks agree on are in the following domains. So first is consent, right? This is really important in that legal area, also really important ethically. So first, we want to ensure that we are creating space for informed consent and voluntary participation. Even if it takes the form of passive consent with opt-out, we want to make sure that that is informed passive consent, that we're sharing information about what screening is, why we're doing it, and what it'll look like for their child. We want to make sure that we're explaining the screening purpose, process, and potential outcomes, and ensuring the right to withdraw, even if that's that passive opt-out. That also falls under the voluntary participation. So folks are considered to be voluntary participants with informed consent if they've received information and have the opportunity to, without judgment and without any sort of punitive sort of action taken, to opt out. So this can't be, your child won't receive X, Y, or Z unless they're screened. We're not able to sort of use those bargaining chips in the ways that we might be accustomed to in schools, because it's important that folks feel that they can make a choice to not be involved in mental health screening without any repercussions. Something that I think is really helpful is having a really clear communication plan at the outset of the mental health screening sort of procedure. So first, you'll notify families of your screening procedures. You can use things like an automated email, phone call, or text message, information on the school website, mail or flyers, and then information in the registration packet. The thing that's really important here is that you should use the same method of communication for screening that you use for other things that families take note of. We don't want to do this like weird one-off, like, oh, there's a flyer posted in the foyer that no one will look at, because the purpose is really that folks have enough information to make an informed choice about their child's participation and can opt out. Then once we notify families of screening procedures, we need to make sure that we are including a way for families to opt out. And secondarily, but still really importantly, that we're gathering student assent, particularly when students are completing a screening themselves, reporting on their own behaviors, feelings, and thoughts. Student assent is really important. And a student, even if their parent hasn't opted them out, should have the choice to opt themselves out if they don't want to participate. So there should be sort of these two gates of opt-out consent, that parents can opt out or guardians can opt out, or the student can opt out if they don't feel comfortable. Then we do our screening, we've done our opt-out procedure. We might do follow-up procedures. So something that I suppose I need to mention is that these ethical guides, when they tell us about consent, talk about the difference between something that is standard educational practice that all students are experiencing versus something that singles out an individual student. Generally, our legal and ethical codes say that if we're doing something for all students, it's a part of our standard educational practice, that opt-out consent is sufficient. When we get to the point where we are singling out students based on data we have, perhaps if we're screening only those students who are failing classes, when we're targeting specific students, that means we need active consent because we are targeting individual students. So as we move on through this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what follow-up assessment looks like. It's important that if we're doing any follow-up beyond this layer of everyone's getting this, that it's important that we get active consent for that. So what that's looked like in situations that I've been in or schools that I've worked in is that we give consent to all students, or we give passive consent and opt-out procedures for all students to complete screening. We complete that screening for the students who aren't opted out. And then with the students who may be flagged as at risk, we had follow-up interviews. Before we had that follow-up interview, however, we obtained active consent. So I called parents and said, hey, we saw based on our screening data that your child flagged as at risk for this particular thing. We really want to make sure that we're noticing all of the things that might be impacting your child's ability to access education. So we want to dig a little deeper. I want to meet with your child to learn a little bit more about what's happening in this area. I'm going to use this assessment tool and might ask questions like this. Are you okay with me doing that? So in the district I was in, I could get verbal consent over the phone, and I signed the date and the method of communication with the parent. Some districts might have different procedures for active consent where you might need to get a formal signature. You could maybe use something digital like DocuSign if your school has that. But really when we're doing follow-up procedures that are singling out individual students for some reason other than everybody gets this, we need to be seeking active consent. Our next set of ethical guidelines are around confidentiality. So we need to make sure that we're protecting confidentiality and privacy. So we need to maintain privacy during screening and data handling, which means that we might de-identify data with a code that has some, information about a student, but that isn't, we can't see the name of. This also means that if we do paper forms, for example, we won't, like have the stack of paper forms with kids' names on them in a place that's freely accessible. We also, when we're reporting back what we've found through our screening, need to make sure that we use anonymous reporting options and de-identify data. Something that a lot of folks are doing, which is really encouraging, is disaggregating data or looking at the ways that different groups of people are impacted differently. For example, we might look at racial and ethnic differences, the ways that students of Black or African-American descent are experiencing something different than their white peers. We want to make sure that when we're protecting or using anonymity, that we're only doing that if we have enough folks in each group that we're not going to be singling folks out. So for example, if I only have 1 or 2 Black 7th grade girls, if I disaggregate, I'm going to know the responses of those 2 girls because there were only 2 of them. I'm going to be able to identify something about them. So when we're using anonymous reporting, we need to make sure that we are, not only ensuring that things aren't linked to a name, but also that they're not linked to identifying characteristics that could allow us to sort of snoop or think or use a Venn diagram to figure out who that person is. Because if we could do it, it's likely that someone else in our school community could do it and know something about an individual child that they aren't intended to know. Then our last sort of set of ethical guidelines for screening are around equity and accessibility. We need to make sure that the screening tools and the screening procedure that we use are non-discriminatory and culturally sensitive. So we want to make sure that we're avoiding bias and stereotypes in screening tools and our interpretations of them. And that we address cultural differences and diverse backgrounds. What this might look like is that we're choosing a screening tool. Again, go back to last month's presentation to learn more about that. But we're choosing a screening tool that's relevant and vetted for our school population. That when we're maybe noticing trends in the data, like perhaps, for example, folks from Black and Brown families or folks who identify as Black or another minoritized racial or ethnic group are screening as more at risk, that we don't look at that as something that is inherent to a particular group, but that we think about the systems and structures that are in place because we're looking at a population level. It's important that we sort of interpret our data with caution and try to avoid biases and stereotypes as we're doing that. Then we want to ensure accessibility and support for folks who might need that in order to access mental health screening. So we want to support access for all students. So for example, if we're doing universal mental health screening, we want to make sure that if it's universal, it really is including all students. We wouldn't want to omit those students who are already on a behavioral IEP and are already receiving some sort of behavioral services because we might see something that we haven't already seen through screening data. So it's important that we include everyone when we're doing this to the extent that is sort of reasonable, possible, and appropriate. And then we need to provide appropriate support services and follow-up when we identify specific mental health needs. So now I'm going to pretty quickly go through a whole bunch of sort of procedures and specific steps you will take after screening. So you'll see here in the top left, universal screening on the broadband level. That's our sort of overall universal screening that gets at some maybe broad themes of risk and resilience factors. I'm going to go through sort of a zoomed in version of this so that you don't get lost in the sauce of all these boxes. Our first step to universal screening, which you learned about last month, is to choose a screener and give it, right? We're doing our opt-out consent here. We're allowing families an opportunity to know about the screening and to make decisions about whether their child will participate. For those who screen negative, we don't see any risk factors, or we see a lot of protective factors. Those kids we're not really following up with. We see right now that their baseline or their neutral today is sort of a safe and healthy place for them to be. So we don't need to follow up. We don't need to intervene there. We're seeing that they're safe and healthy, and we can move forward with doing universal screening on them in the future to see sort of if that changes over time. For those who screen positive, who have significant risk factors, we're going to move on. First, we're going to do immediate follow-up for those who have really maybe the most significant needs, if we obtain information about risk to self or others, we need to make sure that we follow up immediately on that same day. This is why it's really important that we have clear policies and procedures in place, because we're going to need to know what we do with the data immediately. It's not sufficient to say we collected this data, we'll look at it next week or next month whenever we have time. There are some situations in which we really, if there's an item on there about a risk to self or another, we need to make sure we're looking at the same day so that we can intervene quickly to keep our kids safe. This is also something we really need to keep in mind if we're allowing for open-ended responses, or if folks are filling things out on paper where they might, write something on the side, even if we're not asking for open-ended responses. We have to review those responses immediately so that we can complete a timely follow-up on risk, which we know we need to do the same day. Once a kid is screened positive, whether or not we had to do that sort of immediate high-risk follow-up, we're going to make sure that if they screen positive, we validate that data. We need to make sure that we're checking in with perhaps a teacher, someone they know well, or we're completing follow-up assessment to understand whether that data was a fluke, whether there's some other information that maybe would put them in the at-risk category, but is not something that we're going to intervene on right now. For example, when I was doing a particular screening protocol in a district I worked in, at the universal level, we screened for traumatic experiences. We used a trauma screening checklist. For kids who screened positive, we validated via that second gate of an interview. We got active consent for this. We called those families and said, hey, we saw your kid was at risk for this. They popped up and we want to make sure we can provide them the supports that they need. So I'd like to follow up. Is that okay? Once I had that active consent, I completed a follow-up interview. This validating or second gate might look like a lot of things. It might look like a narrower screening tool. It might look like an interview. It might look like double checking with teachers. It might look like a lot of things, but the core piece here is that we're digging more to know the exact nature of the need that might exist. So what we found when we did those follow-up interviews based on the trauma screening we had done, we had a lot of kids where we actually realized that there wasn't a significant need to follow up, that the sorts of things that they endorsed were on the screening tool were things like having experienced traumatic grief, but for them, that meant their pet died 4 years ago, and it still occasionally made them feel sad when they remembered their pet. So we thought there, this kid is pretty safe. They're not having ongoing sort of intrusive thoughts about a form of traumatic grief. And so we validated and realized that sort of those kids were flagged for reasons besides their true need. So here, then we decide whether there's no need or need. Once we validated with that second gate, if there's no need, those kids go back into that sort of tier 1 bottom of the pyramid bucket, and we follow up in the future to monitor how they're doing. If there is a need, if we say, yes, based on the screening data coupled with whatever our second piece of data was, we're seeing that this child has some sort of need, we then might move on. So here are the things that I just talked about. We might complete at our second gate a narrowband assessment. We might corroborate that need with narrative informant input, which just means having a conversation with a teacher or a parent about the needs that the child might have and the ways they show up at school. And then we might consider the fit of needs with available interventions. Following that second gate, we're aligning kids with the supports that exist in our school. So here, there are a broad range of things you might do. For example, you might have a classroom where many students are exhibiting on their universal screening some level of risk for not being able to cope with the emotion of sadness, right? Like that might be something that flags. If there are 10 kids out of a 25 kid classroom who are having that need, it might be your best bet to go in and do a social emotional learning lesson on coping with sadness. So this doesn't necessarily mean, if there's a need, that we're going to have to do individual one-on-one therapy with each kid. What it might mean is that we're finding patterns and creating small group interventions. We're looking at universal interventions to get some sort of service in the hands of the students who are identified as at risk. So we're identifying that appropriate intervention and monitoring progress. So when we're selecting interventions, this should be database decision-making. We should consider our local prevalence, and if more than 20% or so of kids are in the at-risk range, we might consider a universal intervention at the classroom, grade, or school level. Once we're giving that sort of intervention, we need to be monitoring progress through a myriad of ways. So this might look like re-administering screeners. This might look at like measuring something that we anticipate will change based on the intervention that we're doing. If the student responds to that intervention and starts to do a little better, starts to kind of approximate their peers who didn't need intervention in the first place, we can then discontinue those supports and send them back into that bottom chunk pool so that we can monitor what goes on after we've gone through this procedure. If they're not responding to intervention, that indicates that they might need a higher level of care. We might need to perform sort of a different intervention. If here we intervened at the classroom level, the kids who responded to intervention might need nothing more. The kids who didn't respond to intervention might need a small group. If at the identify appropriate interventions and monitor progress, we were doing a small group intervention, those kids who didn't respond to intervention might need something on an individualized level. So when we're monitoring progress, I included just here some best practices for progress monitoring, including that we're aligning data collection to our intervention. So we're using either a validated rating scale or behavioral observations that we would expect to change based on the intervention we're providing. If we're providing an intervention that helps with internalized emotional coping skills, measuring something like the number of blurt outs in class, we're not expecting that to move, right? We're not intervening on that. So it's important that we align whatever progress we're monitoring to what we're expecting to make change on and to what the need is for that child. We want to make sure that we're also collecting baseline data, that we understand where the kid's starting so that we can identify when a change has occurred. We can set a SMART goal, which means that we're setting a goal based on data that is specific, measurable, appropriate, relevant, and timely, I believe are what the letters stand for. I might have gotten the A wrong. That we're graphing the data and looking back at it at regular intervals to see when and how change is happening and what that may be aligned with. And then we're continuing, modifying, or discontinuing the intervention based on the progress monitoring data. So for example, if a kid had on a rating scale was demonstrating through their responses that they didn't have a lot of skills for coping with feeling sadness, right? We're providing an intervention and we're regularly asking those questions that get at whether they're developing skills to cope with sadness. At baseline, they might have had no skills. After a few weeks of intervention, their skills might increase. Once we see that we've reached some level of stability at an increase, we might say, okay, this kid has learned what they need to learn. We're sending them back into the classroom and we'll screen them to see how this goes at the next time point. But right now they don't need further intervention. Another kid might start low, not have those coping skills for sadness. They might have a little boost, but they might go back down or they might never change at all. That would tell us that we need to change our intervention or intensify the supports we're providing. So once we've done that, we've seen which kids maybe need something more formal or something more one-on-one or something more intense because they're not responding to the intervention we've provided so far. Then we might continue with our selected supports and progress monitoring and couple that with referring to some sort of intensive service or program, a community provider, a 504 or an IEP, or whatever that sort of next level of more intensive supports look like at your school. My hope is that when we go through sort of this whole map where we see things loop back, folks go back into that universal group, this is a little bit less overwhelming than sort of the method that folks might take outside of an MTSS system where we say, ooh, a kid is at risk, they need one-on-one therapy. Because really that's not the way that schools can function the best for students. What we need is to sort of over time increase the intensity of supports for children who are not responding to the lower intensity of supports. In this way, there might be 80% of kids that don't need much. We might do a classroom booster session, we might do 1 or 2 check-ins, but they're not going to need that one-on-one support. There might be some kids who need some more small group support, but for those kids, we still don't need to spend all the resources to get them in a 50-minute once a week therapy session. It would be more rare and only for those sort of non-responders that we would need to do that, which can help free up resources for the kids who truly need that more intensive level of intervention. So I hope that this is encouraging to you that screening doesn't mean we're suddenly identifying tons and tons of kids who need deep and thorough intervention that our resources can't manage, but rather that we're sort of mindfully and thoughtfully using our resources across a continuum of levels of needs so that we can hopefully keep some kids from ever reaching that high level of need where they would need that long, significant one-on-one intervention. When we do have those kids who don't respond to the initial interventions and have those higher levels of student need, we can provide those individual supports though, and we're hopefully reserving those for kids who really need them rather than sort of playing whack-a-mole with every kid who pops up with any level of risk or need or concern. So that's sort of this overall diagram or life cycle of a screening procedure and how we do follow up that can help at a population level rather than just playing whack-a-mole with individual kids. This diagram or this chart will be available to you with the resources after this session. So once you get the recording, this will be coupled with that so that you can sort of align some of your supports with the way that this sort of life cycle would work. I also included in the slides a whole bunch of different resources that you can access that talk about sort of step-by-step guide to screening. We also created one specific to the series that you'll get access to once that's posted on the website within about a week. And that really walks through a chunk of things you need to do before screening that we talked about last month, and then the chunk of things you need to do after screening to ensure that you're doing legal and ethical follow-up and that you're helping kids at the level of support that they need. Of course, I hope that you join us for our next session, which will be in about 3 weeks. And we'll be talking about sustainability and sort of what happens once kids are returned to that tier 1 pool and how we make sure that we're monitoring over time and managing our data so that it's feasible for us to notice when something changes. Now, that's the end of sort of my formal content. So I'd encourage you to pop questions you have in the Q&A chat box so that I can respond to them sort of out loud while we're all together. I see that there's already some in here. So one person asked if a participant consents prior to screening and it's opt-in or is opt-out or opt-in the legal standard? So generally, prior to screening, if we're doing a universal screening that targets all students, we can select opt-in. If our initial screening approach is something that we are something that we're sort of targeting based on a need that's emerging among a particular type of student, or we're sort of narrowing that pool based on something that is known about students already, that becomes no longer part of our standard educational practice. We're singling students out. If we're singling students out from some information we already have, that's always active consent. Opt-out or passive consent is no longer appropriate in that situation. Okay, I think I answered those. All right. Did I miss if parents are informed in advance, and do parents have the option to opt out their student? You're right. In pretty much every screening situation, we need to get informed consent. What informed consent looks like, again, varies, right? Informed consent, if this is a standard educational procedure that includes all students, that informed consent can look like opt-out consent, where we're providing ample notification and a procedure for folks to opt their children out. If it's not standard, if it's not sort of standard educational procedure for everyone, then we can use active consent. How are schools staffing for the onslaught of needed immediate high-risk follow-up? That's another really good question. Something that I think can be really important here is not screening everyone in one day and understanding the capacity of your system. For example, if you don't know how many students might flag for some immediate high-risk follow-up, you might start by screening just one class in a day so you can look through those 20, 25, 30 forms pretty quickly and efficiently. What you might not want to do if you don't yet know the level of need you're going to be seeing, or you think you might not have a high level of capacity, is screen all students at once, right? Because if you're in a larger building, you might have 600, 800, 1,000 forms to look through for that immediate high-risk follow-up. And it wouldn't be feasible for most school teams to do that in a timely manner. So something that I think can be really helpful is just biting off what you can manage so that you can kind of keep that in mind. It also can be helpful, although it's, challenging to talk about because we do want to be able to provide support, is consider not providing an opportunity for folks to say something about that immediate high risk. So for example, you might choose not to include a qualitative piece where students can type in a response if you think that you're not going to have the opportunity to follow up with all those students. So just be mindful about the types of questions you're asking, the types of answers you might get, and only biting off an amount that you think is reasonable to respond to. Can you include in the initial screener passive consent language that describes elevated responses will lead to a follow-up interview by trained staff? I think that could be good information to include. I tend to fall on, a side of an abundance of caution, wanting to protect folks. So I still would do some sort of active consent there, but you should follow the guidelines of your state and your school district. But I'm not going to say yes, that would be sufficient, because I would do a follow-up active consent. Do we need to let parents know right away today about the findings of those kids we are not going to send for help today, but plan to do group later? I would say no. So I would say that if you're doing an immediate follow-up for those kids who are high risk, danger to self or others, you would need to notify those parents that day with whatever your crisis response plan in your school or district looks like. However, for those kids who you're trying to align what intervention supports they might need, I would say you don't need to notify parents until you've sort of landed on, here's the thing we're going to do, because you want to be able to provide them informed, clear information. So for example, if the information you have right now is, oh, we're going to try to find something that fits their needs, that doesn't actually help parents, right, be informed or give ample consent. I would wait until you have information so that they have enough info to give informed consent. That would be my approach. Is there any way for those who were not able to attend the first session to have access to it? Yes, there is a recording that I hope someone can paste in the chat. So it looks like in the chat, if you look at the links, there's a one bullet point that says check the recording and slides from part 1 here. Sarah just put it in the chat again. Thanks, Sarah. And then if the concern is about risk for suicide and risk screening is used for a student, is active consent required or suggested? So if you're asking all students, I still would use passive consent, but I would be ready to call parents if there is a heightened level of risk for a student so that you can ensure safety in the immediate. So just make sure that you have an action plan. You also probably know best what your community might respond to. There might be some communities where folks would find that to be really particularly invasive and might want an opt-in consent. You always can go to a higher level of consent, right? So there's no situation where I would ever say, oh, you have to do opt-in instead of active consent. The reason we tend to do opt-out or a passive consent is because it allows us to capture more students, particularly when we have parental disengagement or folks who don't return forms or things like that. So, I would say you always can go to a higher level of consent and have folks sign off, and your community best and what they might respond to, but I don't think that it's a legal or ethical requirement if you're doing that screening for all students. I think I got through all the questions with 2 minutes to spare for our ending housekeeping, but I'll go back a couple of slides and just say, I really hope that you'll join us for the 3rd and final session on sustainability for school mental health screening so that you can continue to provide great support.
You did a fantastic job timing all those questions really well, Miranda. Good job. So thank you everybody for being here. And yes, again, we hope you join us June 21st. Again, all of this will be on our website, the recording and presentation materials within the next week. I will also be emailing. You don't need to give me your emails in the chat or anything. I have all your emails. I will send you a link when it is ready on our website, so you don't have to go searching for it. I'll let you know when all of this is up on our website. Be looking for that. And yeah, we hope you join us on June 21st, and you will be automatically redirected to that very brief survey. We thank you for taking it. It's how we're able to continue providing free trainings to you all. So we definitely appreciate you taking those quick surveys. So we hope you have a great rest of your day, and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye, everyone.